So I sort of seem to be tying together, you know, I seem to be tying together schooling and startup life, where it seems like at every stage of my life when I'm in school, I get the entrepreneurship bug. And at some point, I decided that I really wanted to study this and that there were so many interesting things. And so went to get my PhD, where I was doing research on investor gut feel and looking at how the entrepreneurship ecosystem, how decisions are made, and here I am.
Well, congratulations on your first book. Congratulations on your success as an entrepreneur. Why did you write this book?
You know, I had been studying so many things where I was seeing that in entrepreneurship and in a lot of other contexts, that decisions are not necessarily made by the analytical data. We tend to think that they are, but a lot of times we already know the decisions that we're going to make, for example, and we then post hoc rationalize those decisions, or we use various different ways of actually coming to that. And as I was doing more and more research, I realized that this sort of dimension that a lot of entrepreneurs were feeling was that, hard work is something that we're taught is the secret to success, right? You ask super successful people at the top of their game, what the secret to their success is, and inevitably they mention hard work. But hard work alone is not enough. And we come to that realization because there's so much that are determining outcomes, things like perceptions and signals and cues. And a lot of outcomes and success was being determined based on that. And so, I would get asked the question often, so what do we do? What can we do about this? How do we level the playing field? Are there ways in which we can, are there strategies and tactics and things that we can do as individuals, as leaders, for people in our teams, as entrepreneurs, to sort of level the playing field, to take the perceptions that we're seeing that others have about us and be able to flip those in our favor. And so that's really what the book is about, is understanding, is honing our ability to see what we're dealing with, what we're grappling with, and finding ways to sort of guide those situations and those guide those sort of situations in our favor so that we can create an edge. And I think this book is, something that's sort of on all of our minds. And by the way, I love those of you who are on video. It makes me feel like I'm not speaking into this great abyss. So any of you who would like to, thank you, Zave. I saw you just turned yours on. And so any of you who would like to be on video, hi, Anne and Ellen, and it makes me feel like I'm not talking to sort of boxes, and instead I can see your faces. Hello, Martin. So this is great. So now I've totally lost my train of thought, of course, because now I'm seeing all of your beautiful faces. But I think something that's really like apropos of what we're dealing with right now, like I feel like I can't even do a webinar or an online session anymore without at least acknowledging sort of this surreal reality that we're in right now. I mean, it really feels like an alternate dimension where 2 weeks ago everything was normal, and now all of a sudden it feels like it's temporary.
Well, that's my next question for you.
Oh, am I stealing your thunder, Mark?
No. It's a perfect lead into that, because I think the big question right now is, the world, the country, us as individuals, our whole world's been turned upside down. We're facing, as a planet, a huge amount of adversity. And of course, everybody feels it on a macro level, but very much on a personal level. Some people have lost their jobs. Some people are living paycheck to paycheck. Entrepreneur wrote to me this morning and said that 3 angels that he was counting on to invest in have pulled out. And how are we going to help those people as the Private Investors Forum running the Angel Venture Fair? So what do you advise to these people? Everybody who's
I think this is what's so critical, right? As leaders of organizations and as people who are in the workforce. For so long, the questions and the conversations have been around things like, how do we stay nimble? How do we continue to grow? How do we scale? How do we look for new, fresh pastures? And now a lot of the conversations are about like, how do we weather this storm? How do we support our customers in authentic and viable ways, in ways that we can sustain? And so when, the title of this book is Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage, but really it should have been titled like Turning Your Adversity into Your Advantage. And what I mean by that is that COVID is impacting people differently. It's impacting companies in very different ways. And so just having conversations around how to weather this storm takes out so much of the nuance around what that means for individual companies, what that means for individuals. There are different ways that we then in turn need to handle it. There's different routines that we need to build. There's different skill sets and muscles that we need to build based on what our unique vantage point is. What we're doing instead is, and again, like the book I talk about, we have this love affair with hard work and grit, right? Like we talk so much about hard work and grit, and hard work and grit and effort are critical. I would never say that they're not critical, but hard work alone is not enough. And we're sort of seeing this in a very, very like poignant way right now, because what we're finding is that we remember what things were like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we're trying to replicate what we were doing then in a new reality. We're trying to do the same things. We're trying to get to the same output. We're trying to, it's the equivalent of putting in lots and lots of effort and hard work, and you're just going to hit the same wall over and over and over again. Like we're starting to get frustrated because we're not making the same progress that we were making 2 and 3 weeks ago. But we have to like throw that away, right? I mean, there's an entrepreneur who I was talking to the other day, and he was telling me, he's like, but I had $50,000 in revenue last month, and this month I have zero. And I said, and he's like, I'm trying to figure out how I can get that 50,000 in revenue. And I was telling him, I'm like, you can't think like that. That 50,000, that's gone. You're not going to be able to get that right now. And so it needs to be, what are the things that you were going to focus on now in this new reality? And what I sort of talk about in the book is that part of it is letting go and remembering that hard work alone is not enough. So you can't just be putting in the same type of hard work. You have to first be thinking about, how you're be honing your ability to see how this is affecting and enabling you specifically in a new norm. We have a new norm now. And so it's not just about like, how is this affecting supply chain generally? It's not just about how is this affecting technology generally. It's about how are the differences in supply chain and technology and interpersonal communication affecting you uniquely? And if that's affecting you uniquely, how does that enable you specifically? As we sort of go ahead. And I'm happy to sort of talk about like more specifics and examples of what I mean to kind of, clarify this a little bit, but I also want to give Mark you the opportunity to lead us here.
Well, I also think right now it's a very precarious time. And most everybody who's on this call is actually CEO of a company. Some of them are startups that now have to convince their investors that they should either new investors to put money in or the existing investors on what the path going forward that they thought this. And now you've got your employees worried as well, and your vendors who are worried, will they get paid? I have a client of mine, and she bought insurance for the fact that she was worried about so many bankruptcies. Will she get paid? So what should these leaders be thinking about, and how to lead people and how they set the right mindset for their employees?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the question, right? Because there are no clear rules anymore about where we are, where is there more buffer? Where is there more wiggle room? Where is there more constraint, right? I mean, like one example of this is, if we look at Airbnb, right? And Airbnb had tons and tons of cancellations. You had people who had places that they were renting out, and people who were renting those condos and those apartments and those homes. And Airbnb basically said, in light of COVID-19, we're basically doing away with all cancellation fees. So anyone who is renting a place, you're off the hook, right? This is what we can do to sort of support. And this is how we can kind of support our customers. This is what we can do in a viable way. But then there's the question of, well, who actually is in more need? Is it the people who are vacationing and are able to rent all of these fancy condos and apartments and houses, or the people who are the landlords who now have no income because those cancellation fees have been waived, they're not earning that sort of thing? So should it have been shared? Should it have been the landlords who still got paid? Should it have been the renters who got off? I mean, there's all of these sort of tricky questions. This is why there's a lot of nuance, right? And so I wish there's no one answer for your particular company, for all of you who are thinking through these sort of things. But what I talk a lot about in my research before all of this sort of happened is that, like, understanding the constraint and understanding where we have more buffer is so important, right? What areas are we constantly sort of having to hone, constantly having to feed, versus what areas of our business can sort of run independently for 2 or 3 months before we need to sort of have check-ins. Identify those sort of areas, right? Identify where there's the slack, and identify where there's a lot less slack. And this is sort of what I talk a lot about in terms of going back to our basic goods. We often don't do that. Even when we are in times where everything is flourishing and we're trying to grow, we start thinking about all these things like, and then we can add this new feature, and we can have this new product line, and we can do this, and we can hire these people, and we can grow in all of these different ways. But that's actually the worst way to grow. That's the way that we get off course, and we grow for a little while, but it's temporary. It's not something that's sustainable. So in times where things are going well, as well as in times of constraint, which is what we're in now, it's really important to go back to our basic goods. And so I'll give just a really quick example of what I mean by basic goods. So imagine imagine a restaurant one of your favorite restaurants, and you started frequenting this restaurant before they had a lot of business. Like, you were one of the people who first found this hole in the rough, this diamond in the rough. And you went to this Italian restaurant because they had amazing bread and they had amazing, like, olive oil dip, for example, right? And you enjoyed their pasta, you enjoyed their other things, but what you really loved was their bread. Like, it was just so good. And then they start getting more and more business. They start their menu of offerings gets more extensive. They have different branches in different towns, and then all of a sudden, the quality of their bread starts diminishing because they're focused on all the other dishes that they're creating, lots of different customers, lots of different tastes, experimenting with all those sorts of things. And then they start losing those first customers, right? Those customers that loved this restaurant because they went to it for their basic goods, like their basic things that they were really good at. And we do this a lot in our companies as well. Right? We lose sight of that because we start getting enamored with all these features and different product lines and different customer segments. And we forget those first 5 customers that loved and needed our products and services passionately. And when we can go back to that in times like this, that's when we can sort of weather the storm, right? We go back to sort of those elements, those basic goods. And those basic goods also allow us to see and act upon opportunities to delight in sort of times like this. And delight is one of the fundamental things that I talk about in the book. Well, the book is about how to gain an edge, but edge actually stands for the framework that I've developed over the last decade of my research, which stands for the EDGE. And the E is for how you enrich and provide value. What are those basic goods? The D is for delight, because we don't always have the opportunity to show how we enrich and provide value. And delight, when we're able to delight someone, that's the equivalent of cracking that door open a little bit so that we get that opportunity. And in times like this, the delight is so critical. We need to be able to act upon those opportunities, but we're only able to act upon those opportunities when we truly know what our basic goods are. And then I'm happy to get into sort of the G, which is guide, and
Yep.
the E, which is effort, as we sort of talk more.
So when all these leaders are now coaching their people and making sure everyone stays focused on the new reality that they're now dealing with, how do they communicate to their people?
I mean, I think the first point of communication has to be establishing a new norm. It has to be acknowledging that what we were doing before, and the problem is that so many of us were in this state where we had tons of momentum going, right? There's lots and lots of momentum. And then all of a sudden, that momentum sort of stopped. And we're trying to keep it going to some extent, but we're not realizing that it has to be in very different forms. So the first is sort of acknowledging that this is a new reality, that we're all in this as a team, as an organization, but it's not going to be the same. It's going to be, right? The worst thing you can do, there's one entrepreneur that I was talking with the other day. She's the founder of a company of 35 people. And she basically said, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to try and replicate what we were doing as closely as possible. So what that means is that every single meeting we're going to have is going to be virtual. We're going to have video calls. So there are no calls allowed where it's just audio. We're going to be video. She basically sent all of her employees webcams and headphones and microphones and said everything that you're doing is going to be over sort of Zoom video. Well, that's very, very specific. It doesn't allow people, for example, to be on a call that they're just listening in on, and maybe cooking lunch while they're just listening in on that call. That it puts this different kind of pressure. And
What is she trying to do? The human contact? Is that what she's trying to replicate? Yes, I don't want you to lose your human contact.
That, but also this element of it was also coming from this place of we're so lean already, and I'm worried that if people aren't fully engaged in this and don't continue to be fully engaged in what we're doing, that we're going to sort of lose this momentum that we had. And I mean, I understand, right? There's lots of people that are sort of scared about what's going to happen. How do we weather this storm? But there needs to be sort of guidelines around what's that underlying thing that we're afraid of, right? If the underlying thing is that, hey, we are in a situation where we don't have a lot of buffer, and I need everyone to be 100%. Right? It means that we can't let go. Then there needs to be ways that we sort of figure out how that happens. Maybe it means that you're on less calls, but those calls that you're on are much more targeted. Maybe it means that you are on video calls when you're sort of leading it and you really, but can listen. So there needs to be a new set of rules of engagement. And I think that's what's been really hard for all of us. This is not easy. I mean, it is not easy. There are people who have been working from home for years, and they've said, like, this is not working from home. This is trying to deal with a new set of reality, dealing with a pandemic, and still trying to get work done. Right? That's sort of the framing that we need to be able to go into this with.
So, Laura, what's the biggest mistake you can make when you're dealing with adversity?
I think there's a couple of different things that, in terms of adversity generally, and then adversity in terms of specifically what we're sort of in right now. I think we all sort of know that we will face adversity and that we will face failure, right? None of us is deluded enough to think that everything is going to go right 100% of the time. What happens, however, is that we don't sort of segment that. We don't think like if I were to ask you, what percentage of the time, Mark, do you think things are going to go wrong in your life?
Well, I'm a very positive person.
Okay,
And so I feel, and I feel that there's a certain amount of luck that we don't have control over.
right?
I kind of feel like 75% of the time,
Things
uh,
will go right.
yes.
Perfect. Okay, so 25% of the time, you expect things are going to go wrong. You're going to either face some sort of adversity or some sort of failure or some sort of disappointment, right? And so let's say your percentage is 25% or 10% or whatever that might be. Well, when we go into situations, a lot of times something goes wrong and we're like, oh my gosh, this is so devastating. I don't know that I can't believe this. Or like we stub our toe and we're like, damn it, this like, or we spill something or something goes wrong or we have some sort of bigger failure, right? We expect everything on an individual basis to go right. But we don't sort of say like, oh man, I lost this deal. Well, I guess that's part of the 10%. Or I guess that's part of the 25%, right? We don't do that. We sort of say like, oh my, like for days we're upset about that deal that we lost, or for days we're upset because that venture capitalist said no, right? But we don't chalk it up to 10% or 25% of things are going to go wrong, like on a general sort of basis, right? And so like if I translate that to sort of what we're facing now, right? You're not going to be able to replicate 100% of what you were doing before. You're just not, right? And so when like last week I was like, I got zero exercise. Like I need to figure out like I didn't move more than up a flight of stairs in a day. But again, like, am I going to expect that, that's sort of the 25% or the 10% that we need to sort of figure this out. We need to figure out how we're going to find this new normal. I've heard this expression, this new normal. But again, this has to be about, it has to be specific. There is no, like, here are the 6 steps to getting through our current circumstance. I wish there was a way where I could say, follow these 6 steps. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this. But we have to think about our own individual circumstances and how in any adversity, it's going to impact people differently, right? If I lose a sales deal, I might not care, but if somebody speaks meanly to me, I might care a lot. For someone else, it might be the reverse. They don't care if lots of people, right? There's different things that weigh on us differently. And that's all data. That's data. That's information.
Before I open this up to questions for everybody else, I want to know, do you have any process that you've developed to handle adversity yourself? Like when things go wrong, and I put the 25% as that there are things you have no control over, and that happens. Like nobody had control over this pandemic. And so now you have a whole new reality. Things are just going to happen. So do you have a process for handling these things?
Yeah, I mean, the process, I know it sounds so trite, but the process really is the framework. Really is the EDGE, right? Whenever there's some sort of adversity, I go back to like, what are the basic goods? How am I going to delight? And when you can improvise and delight people, and the G piece is so important. How do you guide? Guiding is about redirecting. It's about redirecting that adversity, those obstacles, those stereotypes, whatever it is, flipping those obstacles in your favor, flipping something that seems like a stereotype into an advantage or an edge. This is a great time in which we can really hone our ability to see how certain things are going to affect us specifically, right? It's a time in which we can see how can we, as I said before, like act upon opportunities. It's a time for sort of seeing how, I'll give you a really quick story to kind of illustrate this. I wrote in my book, I talked about this company called Buc-ee's. I don't know if the hand raising feature works here, but how many of you have heard of Buc-ee's before?
I heard of Buc-ee's before.
Okay, is there a hand raising feature in the participant section, or a yes?
Christine Hurd raised her hand.
Okay, I did see that. I know, and Renee as well. So for those of you who haven't heard, I see some people voting yes. Awesome. Okay. So Buc-ee's is basically a gas station. It's a gas station that's in Texas, and they were going through this particularly tough sort of sort of time where not totally dissimilar to what we're doing right now. And they did exactly this. They said, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Like, people are not coming to, it was a different set of circumstances, but they basically were like, why do people go to gas stations, right? People go to gas stations on road trips because they need gas, they need to use the bathroom, and they need to stop for ice, right? In Texas, people want lots of ice and Dr. Pepper, the founders were telling me. And so three things, and sort of weather the storm at being really, really good at those three things. And while they were sort of weathering this storm and trying to support customers, they were like, we just have to be really, really good at doing those things. And so everyone who's going to sort of stop at our gas stations will know. And the company that now is, when you drive to a Buc-ee's, there's like 50 gas, their bathrooms are pristine. And you walk in, I mean, there's stalls upon stalls, and it looks like this glorious, like marble, like palace when you walk in. And then just ice machines upon ice machines. And when the economy was better, they started expanding into things that were, you know, they have their own line of stuffed animals, they have their own line of food that are branded as Buc-ee's, all these very much more high margin sort of items. And then as times got worse, you know, they kept going back to like sticking with super clean bathrooms, gas at the ready for everyone. And so this is a company now that is still privately owned, massively successful, but sort of knows how to see those opportunities, putting the gas, stepping on the gas, stepping off the gas, delighting in different ways. I mean, when I was there the last time, they had a new line of t-shirts with all of these amazing puns. Like, I couldn't stop saying these puns all through the rest of our road trip, and my husband kept telling me to shut up because I just kept, you know, speaking in puns the whole time. But this is the equivalent of what we need to be doing, is like finding opportunities to continue to delight in good times and in bad times. And that's going to be different, because here's the key: you change one variable and everything else changes. You change the industry that you're in, everything changes. You change the mix of people that you're interacting with, everything changes. You change whether you're remotely working versus in-person working, everything changes. And so what is so important, and what goes back to a lot of my original research on how do you hone, you need to be honing your ability, honing your gut feel, to know what are those perceptions, those attributions that others are making about you and your company and your team and your product and your service based on that current set of variables. So, and what happens when you just change that variable and now you're in a different industry? Or what happens when you change that variable? Because we don't often have the opportunity to just sort of step back and do that. And gaining your edge is really about being able to hone that ability to see those perceptions that others have about you, the attributions that they're making, so that you then can redirect those in your favor.
Laura, so let's ask people to send me a question that I can ask you. So if people could use their group chat and send me a question, then I would be glad to ask Laura that question. Anybody have a question? I think I have the group chat on. Maybe not. Maybe I don't have the group chat on. Could someone send me a question? I'll know.
Oh, we have one.
Okay. And
there's a question. I see it. Hey.
Oh.
Okay, the question is,
okay.
What are your top 3 tips?
There we go. Yep.
What are your top 3 tips for startup companies? So this is so dependent on the type of, I think the type of company that you are. But with a lot of my students, they sort of say, they sort of joke about how I have these mantras, and that after finishing my class, that they can't get these like mantras out of their head. Mantras sort of like hire slow, fire fast, right? They like, and whenever we do a case, and we read a case about how someone made a bad hire, they're like, it's just horrifying. There's like all these bells and whistles going off in my head, and I can picture you and visualize and hear you saying hire slow and fire fast. But it's those are the sort of tips that I'm gonna give you right now. I mean, I think this is not sort of anything mind-blowing, but I mean, I think the first one is protect your cash, right? Like, cash is king, right? It really is. And so figure out, like, if you are bleeding cash, the first thing you need to do is stop the bleeding, right? It's like with doctors, we need to figure out what the root cause of something is, but sometimes we forget that first, in order to do that, we have to stop the bleeding. And so for startup companies, especially now, we need to be able to stop that bleeding. Maybe that means we've lost $16 million in funding, right? That's the reality. That's a startup just last week told me that they had $16 million in committed funding that they're no longer going to be getting. Right? And so how do you stop that bleeding? How do you stop that, right? She basically had to like pare down their offerings, right? It was, it's a medical company where they had hospitals that were saying like, can you help us with X? And she's like, I really want to help them with X because, I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I said, it's going to take you 3 months to develop the offerings in order for you to help them with X. And in the meantime, you're going to lose all of the paying customers that you already have and give that up for the sake of some, bird in the bush, right? This is not a time. You need to be focusing more and more on that bird in hand, and continue to focus on that. Stop that bleeding, the money that's going out, and you stop that bleeding by focusing on what you sort of still do and what you can kind of recuperate from there. I mean, another piece of, right, the hire slow, fire fast, it's so true, right? We do need to fire fast. Like we keep, not even just in startups. We tend to do this in our lives too, right? There's things that we sort of say like yes to, or we don't want to say no. And so we're like, oh, maybe I'll do it in 2 months. And then 2 months comes around and we're like, oh crap, I have to do this thing that I never wanted to do. And I'm doing it because I sort of thought that I could push it off, right? Just fire fast, pull the Band-Aid off. Make sure that we're sort of saying yes to things slowly and saying no to things quickly, but do so with compassion. This doesn't mean you're like, you're brutally saying no to people. This means that you're saying yes to those things that you can support in authentic ways that are very value add, right? Because a lot of this sort of advice sort of sounds sort of brutal, but it's not. The third piece is like, authenticity means so many different things to different people. And you have to find what your own authentic means. This is not something that's strategic and manipulative, right? This is not about managing impressions. It's about, there's lots of different versions of who we are as leaders, as entrepreneurs, as owners of companies. Who you are with your best friend is really different from who you are with your mother or your boss or your kids, right? That's all you. So you can be authentic in lots of different ways because there's so many different dimensions and we're complicated sort of individuals. It's the same thing with our companies, with startups. Right? There's lots of different dimensions. There's who you are with your investors and your investor audience, and who you are with your customers, and sort of reconciling all of that is sort of really, I think, very necessary and very important.
So Laura, I've got a few more questions here. And correct me if I'm wrong. Do you need to be off in at 2:45, or can you stay with us till 3?
I can stay till 2:50.
Okay,
Hope that works for everybody.
So we'll ask you for some short answers to these questions. So
is that your way of politely saying that I'm too long-winded?
I'm just saying, because we have limited time, we need to have shorter answers to your questions. So, yeah. So some advice on honing your perceptions.
So what I talk about in the book is one of the ways to hone your perceptions. I'm assuming this means how others perceive us rather than
Yes.
how we perceive others. Although I do talk about both. So what I say is that life rhymes. Right. So one thing we sort of do is that we face situations in our past that we sort of see like, that left us with a certain feeling, or that left us within a, like it didn't sit with us the right way. And then like later on in our lives, we have something in a completely different context, a completely different situation that perhaps makes us feel that same sort of way. Right? That's how you're building up your ability to kind of hone, like, what was happening there? Why was I uncomfortable? Why was I embarrassed? Those sort of things. Said another way, I mean, I'll give you, I'm trying to do this as quickly as I can, but I give lots of different practical strategies and exercises for how you can actually hone your perceptions. One exercise that I give to my students is called the 10 no's exercise. And what this is basically over the course of a week, their assignment is to get 10 people to say no to them, in different mediums, in different ways, different types of people. And after that, they have to write a paragraph about how they got the no for each of those 10, and they have to present one of them to the class. We find astounding things, right? Because here's the thing, we're so used to, in our lives, wanting people to say yes to us. Like we've been building up this muscle for our entire lives of wanting people to like us, wanting people to say yes to us, wanting to be agreeable, wanting to find that sort of getting to yes. When the assignment is, you have to get to no, right? They have to do that, otherwise the assignment isn't completed. They find that, number one, they find different ways that they communicate to different people. Different people are much more willing, they realize, to say yes to them than they thought. It allows you to sort of hone your ability to see how others perceive you when you flip that, where you see, hey, these are people who typically always say yes to me. How do I push them to the point where they say no to me? What are the ways that I'm communicating? What's the
I
style
don't
that I'm
think President Trump worries about that one.
Well, part of his style, I mean, he's found that part of his style is being provocative by being, like everyone sort of, but you realize that when you're sort of doing this, you sort of hone the way that you communicate and you influence by flipping it and sort of seeing. So that's just one sort of strategy. I can see Mark getting impatient here, so I wish I could go into more sort of strategy and tips.
I'm looking at the time,
But yeah,
and
so
we have
I
some more
talk about lots of
questions.
different ways to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
So the next question is, any tips or techniques about developing your gut feel about what others are thinking about you?
Yeah, so basically, so in terms of developing your gut feel, right, there's different ways that I've actually tried to, in my research, quantify what gut feel. So how do you quantify the unquantifiable? And so the simple answer is that there's some situations in which we should be very, very analytical. There are some situations where we should not be relying on analysis at all, but allowing ourselves to use our intuition and trust those intuition. Part of developing and honing your gut feel is knowing the difference, is knowing in which situations, with which type of people, in which industries do you sort of do that. So there's a number of different ways that I sort of quantified it. One is looking at something called forward flow, a measure of forward flow. So if you go to forwardflow.org, my co-authors and I basically developed this measure where we look at semantic distance between different words that you sort of use. And so without getting too much in the weeds, what we find, we've tested this on 100,000 people, accountants, actors, gym teachers, entrepreneurs, and seeing that there's different matches based on what industries you're in and how you should sort of hone this ability to do this. We also looked, for example, at tweets. So we looked at all the tweets from, for example, Ariana Grande, and then all the tweets from the Dalai Lama. And we found that the Dalai Lama actually doesn't have to use a lot of forward flow. In fact, it's better when he doesn't use a lot of forward flow, a lot of this sort of measure, whereas Ariana Grande, who has to be very, very creative, we want a much more higher score. So part of honing that, developing that, is knowing what types of industries and situations you're in. If you're the Dalai Lama, you're going to hone it in a different way than if you're Ariana Grande.
So the last question we have for you is, I have 4 people who are rowing in the right direction, 4 people that are just sitting in the rowboat, 2 paddling in the wrong direction. This sounds like a joke. all the people have talent and can be coached, but where do I start, and suggestions?
I love this question. This is like, I love this question because this is like, it's something we can all visualize. It's something that we've all experienced, and it puts in a way where Mark is very much like, okay, I'm making this quantitative. There are a total of 10 people. Tell me what to do here. Okay, so the thing is, where are you going? Are you going to go, are you rowing your boat? I'm going to talk metaphorically here for a second, and then I'll link it back to where are you going? Are you rowing your boat to land? Are you rowing your boat to dry land, where then you're going to get on that dry land and you're going to realize that those 4 people just sitting on the rowboat are those who have lots of ability to hunt and gather berries and build shelter and all of the things that you're going to need to do when you get on that island, right? Or maybe those 2 people who are paddling in the wrong direction are the ones that are going to save you because they were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and once you get to that island, they have a specific set of skills. So it's not just about rowing; it's about where are you going to. Now, in the startup world, this is the equivalent of this is sometimes your A+ employees in the early stages are not your A+ employees at the later stages. Sometimes your B employees in those early stages become A employees because they're able to bring others on board, they're able to manage, they're able to help you grow and scale the company. And so where you're at right now, you need to realize, like, what % of my company is devoted to X? What % of my company is devoted to Y? Where am I going in terms of Z? You need to make sure that those people where you are now are not a liability. Right? So those 2 paddling in the wrong direction, they can't be a liability for you. So you either need to move them to the top of that boat so that they can be coxswains or that they can, be doing something else. So you need to that's the piece of, making sure that you don't have that liability, because right now you're weathering that storm and you just can't afford that. But before you toss them overboard, try and see what is it that you need them to be doing. And can you weather their liability? Like, as long as they're not a liability, are they going to be producing something for you in the future? On a micro level, we do this ourselves too, right? We hone our own, like, there's 4 things we're good at, right? There's 4 things that we're just sort of just idling that are like, not good and not bad. And there's 2 things that we're really not good at that are true weaknesses, right? It's important that sometimes we need to hone those strengths, like be really good, take something that we're good at and make ourselves excellent, right? Those 4 people rowing the boat, make sure they're rowing as fast as humanly possible. But how do we actually think about those weaknesses that we have? And how do we balance that? In what cases we're limited in time. So how do we allot that time towards turning those weaknesses into non-liabilities versus turning those things we're good at into true exemplars and strengths? And Zabe, I love how Zabe has like a follow-on question to this, like what, or maybe the company mission is not clear. Yeah, where are you rowing to, right, Zabe? Absolutely. Where are you rowing to? Because sometimes we're just like, we're rowing to fruitful lands, but we have no idea what fruitful lands is, what direction it's in, whether it's the right time of year to get there. So all of that is important to kind of think about in terms of what we do with those 10 people, what we do with those 10 traits of ours, what we do with those 10 parts of our company, and so on and so forth.
Well, Laura, I want to thank you so much for being on today. This is our first of our Best Business Brain series, and I appreciate you being on. You could tell Laura lacks energy. And I want to thank all of you for coming on this afternoon and joining us. And I'm hoping to make this maybe a weekly event where I bring together people to hear some of the smartest minds. Laura, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, and wishing all of the best to all of you. Thanks
all
so
of you
much.
be safe and best of luck with your businesses.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.